And that to me really is the fundamental responsibility of the most senior folks in the leadership team is how are you going to design your organization? Who is going to have authority for what and who's going to have responsibility? And one of the biggest errors or mistakes that happens is misalignment. So sometimes you give people authority for something, but you don't give them the responsibility. And if you do that, what you're doing is, or another way to think about responsibility would be accountability. I mean, anybody who you definitely have more of the background in psychology than I do, Tim. But I mean, even for me, it's obvious. If you give human beings authority or power without accountability, they almost invariably behave badly.
Welcome to the How to Not Execute Your Strategy podcast. I'm your host, Tim Ohai. These are the lessons that make you the leader you want to be. Go to timohai.com to learn more. My guest today is Josh Andrews. Josh is the former head of data and analytics at Qvest, working with Fortune 500 organizations to construct and expand analytics platforms and data-driven efforts. Josh is now an independent consultant, helping businesses use their data to make better decisions. This conversation is packed with real talk, especially around the challenges that leaders have to go through with their own internal teams. I really enjoyed this conversation. See the show notes for more information about Josh and to also get access to the leader guide for this episode. Let's get to it. Josh, it's great to have you on the show today, and especially since you're also in Hawaii now. Aloha.
Aloha.
Love the shirt, by the way. It matters over here. It does. People don't realize that Aloha shirts are part of professional attire. Bank presidents and governors wear these kind of shirts to work on the regular, and to wear anything else is, well, quite frankly, unacceptable. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad you're on the show. I've already done the introductions. Let's start with our question number one. Josh, tell us about a time where you had a strategy that didn't go as planned.
Absolutely, Tim, and definitely appreciate the opportunity to be on here and speak with you. So as I was thinking through and preparing for this beforehand, one of the things that came to me was I've been working in consulting and professional services, particularly in the technology world, for over 20 years. And so I have a couple examples of strategies that didn't go as planned. But one of them that I'd like to talk about was actually at a client. Because again, that's where, from my background, we would see the most of these and kind of how they may go as planned or may go south. So this particular client was actually probably not quite as well known as some of the clients that we discussed.
Yeah.
But this was a large specialty pharmacy. And a specialty pharmacy, for those who might not be familiar with it, this is a little bit different than your local CVS or Rite Aid. A specialty pharmacy will help with more complicated medications, custom compounding, or cases where folks who have ailments who need medications might need multiple medications that might have interactions and so on.
Okay.
And this specialty pharmacy had called us in because they needed to do an implementation for the in-house custom developed software. And they needed to implement a new vendor product to essentially replace the core of their product that tracked all their medication compounding, their manufacturing, their issuing to clients, and everything like that. And so they hired us as a consulting firm. And we were going to, and we did start moving through standard implementation processes and all of these other things. And one of the most important parts is the data migration from the old system to the new system, migrating it all over. And from the consulting perspective, I was in charge of that and in charge of working with the client to help and make sure that all the data was clean when it was migrated, how it mapped to the new system and all of that. Now, so our strategy was, just let's go through, build a plan, talk to the client, gather the requirements, start the migration, set a date for moving over and everything else. The wrinkle that came up in this was not a standard vendor product. The client had actually engaged in what was more or less a beta development partnership with a software development firm that was developing a new product for kind of specialty or compounding pharmacies. And this client was going to be the first implementation partner for this. So wait a
minute. They were doing two strategies at one time. They were doing a major data migration to optimize their own capabilities while they were also working on a new software implementation to sounds just highly disruptive to me. I'm just going to throw
Well,
that out.
so it wasn't just a data migration. There was a whole larger project of which the data migration was one part of.
Okay.
But yes, they were adding significant complexity and risk to what is already a challenging new implementation process for any company by saying, we're not going to use an established existing product. We are going to partner with a software development firm. This will be the first usage of the product. The software development firm will be actively doing development on the product as we tell them how our business works. And, we're not just going to hire a consulting firm to help us with implementation. We're actually going to have essentially consulting services or professional services representatives from the development firm that we're partnering with also involved in the mix. So instead of two people trying to do a waltz together, now you have three people trying to waltz, and the waltz is not a three-person dance, right?
It started to look like a polka.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, yeah. And so, some of the pretty foreseeable challenges came up out of this. There was a lot of conflict between the firm that I worked for at that time, between us and the software development firm, because both of us were essentially trying to communicate directly with the client. But the problem is the client themselves was struggling to manage these two independent, essentially professional firms that they had hired. The client was not giving clarity on responsibility, authority, roles. There was a significant change in leadership at the client while we were doing this. They got rid of their previous CIO and hired a new CIO. Who came in midway through the implementation. And so our strategy of essentially just trying to work with a client and do a standard implementation was not functioning well.
No, that's an understatement. What I'm curious right off the bat was, what was the definition of success for this effort? And did everybody have the same definition of success?
That's a great question. I don't think everybody had the same definition of success. I think the professional services firm, the IT consulting firm that I worked for at that time, and the client, I think we're a bit more closely aligned, which is we want a smooth, low risk transition. We want, all the data migrated over from the old system to the new system. We want no impact and interruption on the clients. And this is a particularly risky type of business because you literally are talking about life and death.
Yeah.
If you don't properly record the medications people are receiving, if you have a lot of regulatory involvement from the federal government on this, I think the software development firm, the challenge was that they were really looking to use this client as a springboard to expand into this new market. And so they had some somewhat conflicting incentives, which is they just wanted to move through the implementation as quickly as possible and get as much information out of the client as possible to be able to move to other clients. They didn't necessarily have the real gravitas of the stability and the risk involved in this. Right?
Oh gosh, Josh, I'm having flashbacks of other situations I've been that have been very similar, where the definition of success is to be done. And it's like, we'll be done. We'll figure it out as we go, and everything's la da 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 da. And there's no sense of anchor points. There's no like, these are non-negotiables. Everything else is. And without that clarity, then it must have felt like the goalposts were constantly moving. Like, wait, I thought we were marching this direction, and now the field's turned sideways, and we have to actually head to the sideline. It must have been a constant battle of fire drills and emails, deadlines looming and emails blasting and all the chaos that ensues.
Absolutely. And in addition to that, the client internally didn't even have strong leadership or harmony about this. So, for example, we would go to their offices and we would see that they would have software development teams continuing to do like agile development cycles and sprints and so on. And we would ask, like, wait, most of the software that you all have internally that's a significant import is what we are involved in helping you, to switch over to this vendor. What are all of these teams and people even doing? I mean, if you're still making significant changes to the software, which you're also in the process of replacing. So there was a lot of kind of the left hand wasn't talking to the right going on.
So what do you think was going on? Because I want to lift from the technical aspects, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm not an IT guy, you know this. At the same time, I've worked in tech, and I know these are all major deals, but the underlying psychology is the critical piece to me. On one hand, what I hear is there are genuine ego-driven agendas that are infecting the work that's trying to be done. There are genuine, I'll call it skills gaps that are infecting the work that's trying to be done. And then there's just good old fashioned information flow that's just breaking down. And that information flow is critical because without it, you can't surface where ego is impacting things or lack of skill is impacting things. It's just you're getting bad news way too late. Is that a fair summary?
I think so. You know, Tim, you and I have talked about this before, how the more you see of how executive leadership's teams work, the more from a distance it can appear planned and smooth and everything else. And the closer you get to it, the more you see how ad hoc it is and really how much of it is just motivated by human emotion and ego, right? Just consistently. And I think there were a few things going on. I think, first of all, the client really didn't know what they were getting into in terms of the contracting process with their software development partner. They had no idea of the risks that they were entering into. They thought, well, we're
Interesting.
just buying something like Microsoft Word, right? You know, and so when they wrote the contract and kind of structured the engagement with the software development partner, they just had no understanding of the risks they were getting into, particularly engaging with what is essentially a startup who has all sorts of instability themselves about writing that. Second, they weren't in harmony even internally. Like when we would engage with the medical side of the business to try and understand what are your requirements, what is the data you have, what risk do you have about your operations, we would encounter regularly that many of the folks on the medical side understandably had a great deal of fear and anxiety about this transition. And that's totally makes sense. And I can understand why they would have that. The challenge was their reaction in many cases was simply to lock down and say, well, we just can't change anything, or we just need to slow this down, or we're not in agreement on even doing this. So there wasn't strong leadership within the client to get everybody even on the same page and say, yes, we need to do this. It needs to happen. Here's a timeline. And everybody needs to work with the partners that we brought in to help.
Was there a
Right?
fear of disruption as this thing progressed and you're watching leaders make decisions? Part of what I'm hearing is that anything like this, anything especially transformative, and this sounded like an element of solid transformation,
Mm-hmm.
has to generate disruption. It just has to. It's not transformative if disruption isn't involved. It's just you're optimizing, which is fine too, but they're completely different leadership skills and different motions. Was there negative reaction from the leaders on the client side as things started to disrupt and they just started like, you know what, let's just stop disrupting? And even though that was literally cutting the project off at the knees, or was there something else going on?
There is absolutely going to be disruption, major disruption, because people, I think, have the illusion that when you do a large software implementation, that sort of, oh, we change none of our processes and people, and we just take the software we're implementing and totally customize it to the way we do business. And that's not the way it works. You mostly have to do it the other way around, right? And as the implementation started to proceed, and we started to get into the requirements and details, and the folks at the client started to realize how much would change, how much risk there was involved, they would understandably become deeply very nervous and anxious when they would understand the implications of the questions that were being asked and the discussions that were being had. There was absolutely a huge amount of fear. And again, I can understand why if I were in their position, right?
Yeah, but at the same time, once fear enters the equation, you're literally hijacking what's going to be a priority, and you're literally hijacking all decisions that'll be made because you're running
Mm-hmm.
from a different part of your brain. And the fear
Mm-hmm.
part of your brain cannot be neutral. It doesn't know how to not lead with emotion. I mean, we call it amygdala hijacking. And it sounds like there was amygdala hijacking going on as major decisions needed to be made. As this project continued to roll down the hill and snowball into greater and greater chaos, it just sounds so familiar. Forget this situation, because now I want to expand it. There's so many other clients who have the same kind of problem.
Mm-hmm.
What are the big skill sets that you see missing in those leaders who allow these snowballs to turn into avalanches. If you are like most leaders, you learned how to execute strategy through trial and error, and your teammates learned the same way, if they've even learned it at all. The result is that how we execute our strategies generates massive waste and fatigue, but it doesn't have to be this way. If you'd like to master how strategies execute, go to timohai.com/masterclass now. You'll find everything I use to help my clients thrive all in one power-packed place. Don't you think it's time to invest in yourself? All right, back to the interview.
That's a great question. I think a few skills come to mind. First of all, there are some aspects of these projects, if you don't do the contracting and risk management up front, and you don't have the right sort of structured legal agreement in place, it's going to be very difficult to fix it after the fact, right? So you get this contract that's written by people who don't understand any of the technology or the implementation process. And then after it's done, it gets thrown over the fence to the technology teams and say, all right, you got to implement this now, or you have to be involved in it. So I think that the skill that we're talking about here is the skill of negotiation, both from an informal and a formal perspective, right? Second, I think there's a lack of epistemic or sort of organizational humility. Almost every organization that we interacted with said, we're so special and we're totally different from everybody else, not just this particular client, almost everybody. We have to have custom software. We can't do it off the shelf. Or if we do off the shelf software, we have to massively change it on implementation, which massively increased the risk.
I'm smiling, so I've heard that. So we're special, we're different. Oh my gosh, I've worked with so many industries, and at the same time, there are aspects that are genuinely unique. And at the end of the day, it's all the same work because it all involves human beings, and human beings don't vary dramatically from organization or industry or country to country. There are some fundamental truths that just aren't negotiable, which is interesting that you bring up negotiating first and then you bring up humility. And I can see how the lack of humility, or we'll just call it self-awareness, the lack of self-awareness will actually derail or force negotiations into a negative space.
Yes.
Wow. So, Josh, there's this whole element around authority and how people make decisions using the authority they have as leaders. How do you navigate that?
I think one of the most important pieces up front is, as a colleague of mine said one time, how do you draw the boxes in your company? Or another way I've heard it phrased is everything's a seating chart, which is a way to say who has authority and who has responsibility for what in your company. And that, to me, really is the fundamental responsibility of the most senior folks in the leadership team, is how are you going to design your organization? Who is going to have authority for what, and who's going to have responsibility? And one of the biggest errors or mistakes that happens is misalignment. So sometimes you give people authority for something, but you don't give them the responsibility. And if you do that, what you're doing is, or another way to think about responsibility would be accountability. I mean, anybody who you definitely have more of the background in psychology than I do, Tim. But I mean, even for me, it's obvious. If you give human beings authority or power without accountability, they almost invariably behave badly.
Bad things happen.
Right? Bad things happen, right? For all sorts of reasons I won't go into. So that is an error or a problem and will cause all sorts of organizational problems. The reverse can happen, though, too. And I actually see this happening a lot in modern organizations where people are given responsibility or accountability without authority. And that, gets into almost the basic psychological aspects of, as an individual in any area of my life, do I have capability? Do I have some level of control? Or am I simply sort of at the whim of fate or others who have power? And I think this is related to some of the stuff you've been talking with about trauma, right, Tim? About powerlessness?
Yeah. If you feel helpless, that's the root cause emotion for anybody going through trauma. And so now we're starting to see work is becoming traumatic. Jobs are becoming traumatic because the sense of helplessness that people have, they have responsibility and accountability to get a job done without being empowered to do it.
Yes. And people feel like their jobs are meaningless. They feel they sort of all this David Graeber's kind of, discussion about jobs and power and why people are leaving the workforce and so much mental illness and all this other stuff. So the ultimate point is, as an executive, if you're not setting up the right balance of authority, responsibility, and accountability in the way you're designing your organization, you're just setting up an organization that's going to fail.
This is such a fascinating idea because how many organizations are sitting with this tension? You have senior leaders who have authority, but they're unwilling or unable, if I'm being kind, to be accountable. And you have an army of people who are accountable without any authority. And it feels like that's the tension point that's driving the bulk of what I'm seeing with the burnout, the lack of engagement, and all the other stuff. And of course, that leads into retention issues where people who are literally fighting on the front lines to get things done and deliver the result they're supposed to deliver without being empowered to do it and without even being clear on what success looks like. They don't know what they're supposed to do because the goalposts keep moving every time there's a meeting. They get off one Zoom or one, phone call with their boss, and then a day later, everything's changed. We're doing something different now. And so because that constant shift of what success looks like, people are forced into creating their own definitions of success and then try to do that, and the rug's pulled out from underneath them. And it's just constantly going and going and going with no end in sight.
I mean, I've had very personal experience with this in my career. One of my previous engagements, I was responsible for leading up the analytics platform that ran the whole business. And, we would pull in the data from all of these different systems that the business ran on, and we would do some relatively complicated calculations and transformations and come up with all the numbers around profitability and margin and staffing and everything else. Well, the challenge was that the finance team, particularly the CFO, would sometimes just go in to the financial system, change things, and let us know after the fact. And
Wow.
they didn't feel the responsibility or the accountability that they weren't just responsible for the finance system. They were responsible for changes they made that would affect the analytics and reports and the decision making for the whole company. And, ultimately the CEO refused. It wasn't just an issue with the CFO. This has to get back to accountability and responsibility. In a healthy organization, the CEO would have said, you know what, CFO finance team, you're not just responsible for what happens in the finance platform. If you make changes in there, you're responsible for all the downstream implications of that. But the CEO didn't want to do that. Right. And so that left me in a place where, as ultimately I was sort of the use Truman's point about the buck stops here, right? I was the one that was responsible for ultimately the accuracy of the metrics. So I had accountability for it, but I didn't really have authority over everything that went into it.
That's frustrating. It's incredibly frustrating.
And by the way, this is one of my kind of the fundamental core of my career at this point is helping companies set up and run analytics platforms. This is one of the reasons why data teams and data work is so stressful, frustrating, and even sometimes traumatic, is that this dynamic of sort of the data team has responsibility for delivering the accuracy of all these metrics and reports. But you have misalignment in the organization about folks who are entering and maintaining the data upstream and where it comes from. The data team ends up being responsible and accountable, even though they're not the ones that have control over the data of where it's coming from. And when you get into the details of, okay, how can we move that responsibility and that accountability through the organization? The other folks often want to say, well, oh, that's a lot more accountability and responsibility and details. We don't want to have to be responsible for that.
It's so funny. It reminds me of an old phrase, and I'll apply it. When I meet a data person, I can tell you right off the bat, I don't know if you're stressed right now, but I know that you will be. Yes. Because of what you do. That I think of the data people I've met, they're all somewhat stressed or about to be stressed no matter what because of this dynamic.
Well, and often I think most folks resort to trying to use technological solutions for this. And there are some things about data monitoring and all that, but it's not really a technological problem. It goes back to the core of what we're talking about authority and responsibility. And if your boxes or your seating chart in your org is set up so that your data team has a lot more accountability, but they don't have authority over the causes of those things, yeah, they're just going to be, that's why they're inherently, it can be such a frustrating career at times, right?
That's so good. That's so good. Okay, what else?
I think having a balance and a healthy relationship in your leadership team between your technologists and your non-technologists. When you get organizations that are sort of run on very Taylorist kind of all knowledge is fungible kind of principles, and your technologists don't have any role in sort of your executive leadership kind of decisions. Even they need to be in the strategy, not just in the tactics, but in the strategy.
I want to jump in because what you're tapping on is this concept of dependencies, right? So we understand the outcome you want to achieve as an executive team, but the dependencies required to achieve that outcome need to be explored before we start making promises. And what I'm hearing you say is people don't even pause long enough to even discover just to label the dependencies, let alone figure out, do we have them ready to go? Are there special things that we're going to have to do in order to make those dependencies available? Are there requirements that things need to happen first in order to sequence the ability of those dependencies to come online? It sounds like that is completely missing from these examples where you have bad strategy implementation, even bad strategy, let alone when it is present, it seems to transform the initiative and make it so much better. Is that a fair summary there?
I think that's absolutely a fair summary. Yes. And then, you mentioned not being aware of dependencies, and I think you were addressing it more from a perspective of unawareness or unconsciousness. That is sometimes the case. What I have also seen in larger organizations is actual intentional engineering for autonomy, where people are aware, but they just find it inconvenient or frustrating and they don't care. So they're intentionally actually going out of their way to saying, we're going to ram it in as far as we can the way we want to for us. And then we're going to try and get the initiative far enough along so by the time other people become aware of it, it's too late. So that can happen too.
Yeah, I've been guilty of that. Well,
I mean, haven't we all, right?
You get so caught up in like, this is the right thing to do. Let's just make it happen. And let's do the incremental stuff now just to get this thing moving. And you're pushing hard to really drive the right change in the organization because it is the right change. And at the same time, if you don't respect the diversity of thought required to make this decision at this time, and I think that's what you're saying as well, is the hubris, that lack of humility really does cause major dysfunction that can cause not only poor implementations, but people leaving. And we've all got major problems with retention now because people are tired of working environments where leaders with this lack of awareness keep shoving things down people's throats because, well, it worked in the past. Yeah. Josh, any final thoughts or advice for people listening to this conversation?
I think technology is a very important part of the modern organization. I mean, every company in essence is a technology firm at this point. You can't not be. I think there's no substitute still for having trust among your leadership team and with your company and being thoughtful about how you're making decisions in the second and third and fourth order impacts of those decisions.
Thank you. Josh, it's been a joy to have you on the show, and I appreciate you and I appreciate your friendship.
Tim, I appreciate the opportunity to speak on here. I've learned so much from you in our discussions over the last couple of years, and I look forward to further dialogue.
I hope you enjoyed that interview and got some solid takeaways. Here are 3 that I'd like to highlight. 1. Your definition of success matters more than you realize. When teams are not operating with the same definition of success, you are guaranteed to generate waste and dysfunction. This also means that if you're dealing with waste and dysfunction, you should quickly get everyone to redefine what success means so that your team can get back on track. 2. Dependencies. Execution relies on your dependencies being addressed proactively. You do not have a good strategy to launch if the dependencies have not been identified before you start. 3. Accountability must come with authority. Giving people authority without accountability will generate toxic behavior, and giving people accountability without authority will generate helplessness. In closing, there are 3 things that I would ask of you. First, follow me on LinkedIn and subscribe to my LinkedIn newsletter. You'll get even more content that will both challenge and inspire you every week. Second, please share this podcast with at least one other person right now. And third, hit those rating stars on whatever platform you downloaded this podcast. When you do that, it raises the visibility of what we are talking about to people just like you. Holomua, onward and upward.